Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Since it began to form thousands of years ago, coastal Louisiana has been one of the most important areas for wintering waterfowl in North America, and the world for that matter. But as anyone familiar with waterfowl and wetlands knows, Louisiana in modern times has been the epicenter of some of our greatest and longest standing challenges for wetlands and waterfowl. And as such, there are a tremendous number of stories and issues to discuss from that region. Today's episode will feature another one of those many stories. Today, we're going to be talking about a subregion of the Louisiana coast that stands out as a rather unique area. It's often held up as a prime example of how historical marsh building occurred in that landscape and proof that those processes still work if we have the hydrology in place to enable them. That place is the Atchafalaya Delta. We're going to discuss some of those marsh building processes, but we're also going to talk about the historical abundance of waterfowl on the Delta and how it changed through time. And we're going to tell some stories based on personal observation, experience, and some data that offer potential explanation for these changes. To help me with this story, I'm happy to welcome in two guys that I have known and been friends with for over 15 years. Mike Carlos, Director of Conservation Programs for the western portion of DU's southern region, and Larry Reynolds, Waterfowl Program Manager for Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Mike.
Hey, Mike.
Larry, you're kind of a repeat offender, we might say, on the podcast. So we're going to get to your introduction here in a minute. But Mike, I want to jump to you and have you provide a brief introduction to your professional background and just introduce our listeners to yourself and what you do for Ducks Unlimited these days.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I retired from wildlife and fisheries. I had a career about 28 years, started in 1985 full-time. And was first assigned to Marsh Island Wildlife Refuge and worked there for 8 years and then moved over to Atchafalaya Delta as a supervisor there. And I managed that area for 5 years and then moved on. Kind of took a stint with state parks and then another stint within RCS doing coastal restoration, and then came back to wildlife and fisheries in 2004. And stayed there till 2014. In my last 5 years, it was kind of in administration in Baton Rouge. So, but most of my work was involved with coastal operations and the WMAs and refuges along the coast. So that's, and then I started out at Rockefeller Refuge as a student worker, did that for some time and got to work with some of the great legends, Ted Johannan and Larry McNee, some of those guys, Dave Richard. So a lot of fun in that, and then moved over, took an early retirement to come to DU, started out as manager of conservation programs back in 2014, in January 2014, so almost 7 years ago, and then moved into the director position about 3 years ago. So with that, I oversee our conservation programs, the engineering and the biologists that we cover South Louisiana, Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mike. I wanted to jump in. I wanted to jump in at the beginning, but I chose not to because I was going to let you finish. But then I wanted to clarify, and this is sort of second nature to the three of us in these conversations that we've had through the years, having worked together so closely. You started out saying you're retired from wildlife and fisheries. When you said wildlife and fisheries, you're talking about Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. That I wanted to make sure that was clear. I don't think you ever said that your first work there in Louisiana was actually with LDWF. So I just wanted to make sure we connected that dot for our listeners. So
correct. Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of a neat aspect of this particular conversation because, like I said, the three of us work so closely together that we know what one another is thinking and when they're saying these things. But part of my responsibility here, I guess, is to ensure that we're communicating that to our listeners. And so, Larry, as I mentioned, you've been on the podcast here several times before, so I'm not going to ask you to go through your entire career history, but just briefly for those that may be tuning in for the first time or that may be relatively new to our podcast series, tell people what you do for wildlife and fisheries these days.
I'm the Waterfowl Program Manager for the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. I've been in that position since 2008. I actually started my career here in Louisiana with the Department of Natural Resources doing coastal wetland restoration. And I worked in coastal restoration for 6 years before moving over to the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries as the North American Waterfowl Management Plan Coordinator in 2005. And then I took over the program in 2008. And I've been in that position since 2008, and I intend to finish my career there.
Well, that's good, Larry. And so it's actually, this is one of the episodes that have been looking forward to the most because, as I've said, we've worked together a lot. This is a topic, as we get into it, that three of us actually know a fair bit about. So, and I know the stories here are pretty intriguing, and I'm confident that our listeners are going to appreciate them. We will eventually get into the meat of this discussion about the Atchafalaya Delta, changes in waterfowl numbers through the years. But first, Larry, I thought that it might be appropriate to give a brief recap of the results from the November aerial waterfowl survey. That's usually what we have you on the podcast to discuss. And so we are recording this episode here in the week of Thanksgiving. But I know you flew the aerial surveys a couple of weeks ago, so they're a bit dated. A couple of weeks dated at this point, but I nevertheless wanted to give you an opportunity to provide a brief recap of what you saw during your surveys.
Well, it's always good to know where we started, Mike, and we always fly this survey the week before our earliest duck season opens, typically in the coastal zone and or the west zone. And we flew this survey that week, and it was, I guess it's pretty easy and simple to say, it was the lowest on record. Since we began this survey in 1969, we've never counted fewer ducks than we counted on November 9th through the 12th when we flew this survey. Only 855,000. Only the second time that this survey has been below 1 million birds. But the previous lows in 2008, 2013, and last year, 2019, at 1.04 million are the four lowest surveys on record. The survey areas, Southeast Louisiana, Southwest Louisiana, and Catahoula Lake were all down. The count in Southwest Louisiana was the second lowest on record for this survey. In Southeast Louisiana, it was the lowest since 2009, when we had record rainfall in October and river levels were really high and the habitat was just flooded out. Catahoula Lake has also been flooded from the hurricane-related rainfall, and it had just fallen back into management targets. So the water level wasn't bad, but all of the great moist soil vegetation that we reported on in September had been inundated. The resources look pretty compromised from that standpoint, and very few ducks were seen on Catahoula Lake. So it was a widespread poor survey result to start our regular duck season.
Larry, how many hurricanes or tropical storms did we have impact the Louisiana coastline this year? Was it 3 or 4?
Well, I think we had 5 named storms that impacted. Obviously, Hurricane Laura and Hurricane Delta were the biggest ones that pounded Southwest Louisiana. Actually, a direct hit on some of the best waterfowl habitat in that region of the state. But then we had Hurricane Sally and then Hurricane Beta. Brought a lot of rainfall and storm surge and saltwater intrusion to the marshes in Southeast Louisiana. So it's been a rough year for those of us on the coast.
Man, there's been so many this year, as you say. It's been a tough year, and I hated to see that. You guys still live down there, but we had lived down there for 13 years, and hate that so much for all the people and all the habitats in that region. I had the had the good fortune of being down in Southeast Louisiana for a couple of weeks here recently, doing some fishing. And I was actually down there the week that you were flying the survey, Larry, and I can attest to how the water levels were very high in the marsh. And unless you're a diving duck, there weren't very many groceries that were going to be accessible to you. And I think your surveys sort of bore that out. Most of what you saw in Southeast Louisiana was divers. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, it was only the diving duck species, scaup and ringneck ducks, that were at or above their long-term averages. All other species were below long-term averages, except for mottled ducks. We saw a nice increase in mottled ducks from 19,000 in November of 2019 to 27,000 this November. And so that's at least a hopeful sign. It's similar to what we saw in September. But we're still far, far below long-term average for that species.
Yeah, well, we'll take all the good news we can get for that species. That is for sure.
Amen.
Let's see. So it's been obviously a tough year and a tough start to the waterfowl hunting season there in Louisiana. But I know both you and Mike were able to get out, and you're giving it your best shot to try to chase some of these birds. And so we may cover that at some other time. But right now, I did want to transition to our discussion. I just thought it would be appropriate to give a bit of a recap of those waterfowl survey results. So again, partly because that's what people expect from you on the podcast, Larry, but also to provide a brief glimpse at some of the most recent data out of Louisiana. The topic here at hand is going to focus on the Atchafalaya Delta, also the Wax Lake Delta, and we're going to tell people exactly what those are. But this conversation originated as a result of an email, which I think actually followed your distribution of some of your waterfowl survey results, or the distribution of waterfowl survey results from a colleague of ours, Dr. Joe Marty, there at Rockefeller. They fly aerial surveys across some of the state managed areas. And I think the observations were that there were some low numbers on some of the areas, and long term, there were some pretty noticeable declines in waterfowl abundance. And one of the questions that this little email chain generated was specific to the Atchafalaya Delta that a person inquired about. Do we know what's going on with the Atchafalaya Delta? And the reason that might be of interest, that particular area might be of interest, is because, as I introduced at the outset, that's an area that provides quite a contrast to many other areas along the Louisiana coast, where we think about degrading marsh and marsh loss, and in the southeast Louisiana and southwest Louisiana. But the Atchafalaya Delta and Wax Lake Delta is an area where we're actually seeing marsh creation. Marsh is continuing to grow and expand annually. And so when you see waterfowl numbers there in the Atchafalaya Delta decline, you start thinking, well, what the heck's going on there? We can't really totally attribute that to a change in habitat. So that's what generated some responses from the two of you, as well as some of our other colleagues. And the stories that you were telling I found very interesting, and thought they would be to our listeners as well. So to get this started, Mike, I want to get you to provide our listeners with an introduction to the Atchafalaya Delta, as well as the Wax Lake Delta. Where are they? What are they? What do we need to know about them to set this conversation up?
So Atchafalaya Delta Wildlife Management Area is a wildlife management area that was established in 1979 by Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. And it came about essentially as a result of the Delta prograding, right? So the Wax Lake is just to the west, which comes out of Wax Lake Outlet. And that starts off, essentially the Wax Lake Outlet was dredged back in 1942. And it was from 6 Mile Lake up in the basin, kind of northeast or east of Morgan City, and west of Morgan City, and dredged 15 Mile cut all the way to the Gulf, which essentially was Atchafalaya Bay. So in those days, it was Atchafalaya Bay, right? It was much like Vermilion Bay and some of our other bay systems. It was the bay shore. This was dredged out into open bay water, right? And then over time, we had the big flood of 73, of course, of the Mississippi River, and that filled in a lot of the basin and really forced more of the sediment to the south, both through the Atchafalaya River and through Wax Lake Outlet. And the Atchafalaya River is a maintained navigation channel by the Corps of Engineers. So they had to start dredging and dumping that material somewhere, right? And this was before it became a WMA. So the Corps was just dredging and depositing, and they were depositing on the west side of the channel, close to the bay shore, the historic bay shore. And that's what we call Big Island now. And now it's a 2-mile island, 2 mile long and about a mile wide. In some places, it's over 10-foot elevation. And somehow back in the day, that's state land, right? So if you start getting emergent land in an open bay system, that becomes state land. So the state owns it, and then Wildlife and Fisheries signed into essentially a free lease to make it a wildlife management area and to manage it for duck hunting. And it started, people started finding out about it in the probably, I would say, early 80s, maybe even a few in the late 70s. But if you go back in time and look at some of the aerial photography, there wasn't much to hunt there, right? Even in the early 80s, the Wax Delta was very, very small, what looked like little splays, but of course we had land building through man-made dredging right over on the main delta. And then we also needed to work with the Corps. We realized, or the state realized, we need to start working with the Corps to start being able to place this material beneficially on the main delta. So the whole area encompasses just under 138,000 acres, which was essentially all of Atchafalaya Bay. And it's comprised of those, what we call the Wax Lake Delta and the main delta, or the Atchafalaya River Delta. Over time, the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries promulgated rules and regs for the area, et cetera. And it kind of started out because it was much like Pasalucha, a tidal area that you could hunt all day kind of thing. And that kind of stuck, and it was very few people hunted it, right? And then we'll talk a little bit about more. I don't want to jump into more of this stuff, but that's essentially how it was formed and how it started. And now we look at it back, a few years back when we put some of this information together for potential 2 o'clock closure, we figured it's about 20,000 acres. 20 to 30,000 acres now on each delta that's essentially huntable. And that means people that are even going pretty far out in open water, but shallow open water, right? Almost outside of submerged aquatic vegetation. So you're looking at about a total of 40 to 50,000 acres roughly. That's essentially hunted for waterfowl for the most part.
Mike, I want to back up here for some additional orientation. I oftentimes encourage people to use Google Earth or Google Maps as a resource to help them understand what we're talking about. And this is a perfect example of where the technology of Google Earth is going to be the best the best platform in this case, because as you mentioned, you can actually use the historical imagery feature in Google Earth to see the formation of these deltas. So in order to find them, people can just enter Atchafalaya Bay. And if you can't spell Atchafalaya, you can just enter Morgan City in the search bar, and it's going to take you in proximity to that. You back out a bit from Morgan City and you look kind of to the south and slight southwest, and you're going to see these two delta splay areas. The one on the right is the Atchafalaya River. The one on the left is to the west is the Wax Lake outlet. And so Mike, you referenced that, but I want to get you to tell me again about that Wax Lake outlet. People can actually see on their map how it eventually connects up there with an offshoot of the Atchafalaya River. Yellow Bayou is what it's labeled here on my map. Tell me again, what was the thinking or the reason behind that cut? I think I know, but I always get this confused in my mind.
Well, it was flood control for Morgan City, right? To divert some of that Atchafalaya River water that goes right through Morgan City, right? To divert that over to the west and relieve flooding. and to take about 30, the goal was to take about 30% of the flow, just to relieve that pressure. And that was built in 1942. So this was during World War II, right? And to think that the Corps of Engineers was putting that kind of resource into dredging this huge channel, a flood relief channel, essentially, is kind of, I guess, paints a picture of how serious the flooding events were. And I guess especially since, back in the 27 flood and whatever, and knowing that I guess river levels were pretty high and getting really worrisome for Morgan City, which was, in those days was starting to become a bustling oil and gas, the early days of oil, right? So anyway, yeah, so that's how it was built and when it was built. And I guess in those days, nobody had any idea that there was that much sediment that was going to be coming down, and eventually, and after the basin kind of started filling in and just making this huge delta, man-made delta over at the Wax Lake.
Larry, I have a question for you, I guess, related to this. I want to get your thoughts on this, your perspective. I sort of introduced this a few minutes ago, where when we think about coastal wetland loss in Louisiana, we're seeing losses. We're seeing a negative trend in the southwest and a negative trend in the southeast. But when you look sort of along the central coast, certainly around this basin, depending on the scale at which you look and where you draw the boundaries, you can actually see some gains. When you focus in on the Wax Lake Delta and the Atchafalaya Delta, you can definitely see the gains. Talk about that, Larry. I guess just from a geologic process standpoint, for the people that may not be familiar with it, I at least want them to come away with some appreciation for what's happening and how it's in contrast to what we're seeing, let's say, to the southeast Louisiana. Can you do that?
Oh, absolutely. Because it's the process that's important. One of the major problems with coastal wetland loss, one of the major sources of coastal wetland loss, is the deprivation of sediment from the marshes alongside of the Mississippi River. We have leveed the Mississippi River all the way out to the continental slope. And so a lot of that sediment that used to spill out and form deltas or be pushed to the west via the Coriolis effect to nourish the marshes and the beach ridges as far as even southwest Louisiana, all that process has been halted by the levee building alongside of the Mississippi River. What the Atchafalaya Basin represents is where that process is still functioning, where those marshes have not built out across the continental shelf, to the continental slope where it falls into deeper water. And so you're seeing that natural process work. Louisiana was formed historically by this process of deltaic building, of marsh building, then leveling out the flow of the Mississippi River such that pressure builds up further north and that river shifts location to a place where it's going to flow down a steeper grade. And then it builds land, builds the delta until that grade becomes effectively zero. And then the river changes course again. Well, that's been stopped. That's been stopped at its current location. But through the Wax Lake outlet, through the water, remember, in central Louisiana, we're actually diverting some of the Mississippi River water from the Mississippi down the Atchafalaya. So it's just a sort of another tier of diverting water that brings that sediment and that fresh water down the Atchafalaya River. And then the Wax Lake outlet takes a portion of that. And this process is still working. And so we're able to see, everybody is able to see the building of those marshes.
You can actually see these two deltas sort of closing in on one another. And it's going to be interesting to see here as this goes forward, if a bay isn't built kind of on the backside in between these two deltas. Is that the way some of these inland bays, or these sort of, I shouldn't say inland bays, but some of these inland lakes have formed? Is that what's going to happen there? Do you know what I'm talking about there, Larry? And is that what you would expect?
as these two deltas extend, sediment is going to be moved to the west. And so over a period of time, we may end up with a lake right in between the two.
Yeah, so it's really cool to be able to see this in a relatively short time frame. Mike, you were talking about how the marshes there in the Atchafalaya Delta didn't really start to show up in large acreages until what did you say, the 1970s?
Well, to the early 80s, there wasn't a whole lot even in the early 80s. But that's when you first started seeing, these splays in emergent marsh. Yeah, and a little bit of land that maybe was going to start becoming willows, right? So in the early 80s. Yeah.
So I always use the Atchafalaya Delta and the Wax Lake Delta as an example to refute that saying, where people oftentimes say, well, they're not building any more land. And when somebody asks you if you should buy property or something like that, the one thing they say, well, the only thing I can tell you sure is they're not making any more of it. And I say, well, actually, there is one place, at least one place where there is more land being built. And so I guess to transition here, that new land in the situation in which it emerges, in which it develops, is incredibly valuable and productive for waterfowl, for other fish, other wildlife, other water birds. And Mike, I want to get you to talk a little about what that habitat looks like. You've kind of described it a bit already, but what are the dominant plants that emerge? What are the plants that are most valuable from a waterfowl standpoint that we encounter there on the deltas?
Okay, that's a lot. But I will start off. So essentially, and what you have now, right? What you have now is a building delta, not old delta because it's still new, right? But you look at the heads of the first splays that formed. So a splay, of course, would be where the first material that Larry was talking about deposited and started building. And then those kind of form a V shape, right? And the tops of those are the furthest north of those points. Gets higher and higher, slows down more water and builds. And then, it starts off with being submerged aquatic vegetation, and then transitions into stuff like duck potato or a variety of other Sagittarius species, and then continually builds. And then you start getting woodies, like willows coming in. And then that's kind of the old, now that's less productive, right? They're higher elevated. They flood a little bit, but not much. And then that Sagittarius, you get elephant ear and other things, they get real high. But of course, the duck food is, Delta duck potato is a big one. And then the submerged aquatics, and then even annual plants, right? The sedges. So it just that transition, but so that's what you see. You see these older splays, they develop into that, and then you keep building new splays further south and east and west, right? On the wax. That's what happens. And then on the main delta, we have tried, and the department still tries to mimic that as best they can, right? In the confines of working with the Corps of Engineers through the beneficial use process of dredging and placing that material, but trying to build somewhat these V-shaped islands. But of course, you're starting at about a +4 foot elevation, right? But and then you're cutting it to start trying to mimic that process. But you've just, enhanced it greatly in terms of time, and not nearly as productive, if you ask me, but you get that, the back ends of that becomes more natural on the main delta, that becomes more of a wax type system, right? More of a natural system. But the diversity, plant material is phenomenal. And obviously the waterfowl found it, right? And Delta duck potato was the big thing. Those tubers that they produce are highly desirable. Mallards used to love them. You would find the tubers in their throats and canvas back, and you could watch birds just really make craters out of those flats. It was pretty impressive. On a low tide, you could go out there and look like the surface of the moon from those birds just digging into that substrate and digging up these tubers. But there's no shortage, and I could go on and on, but I'll shut up. I mean, it's just it's so dynamic, and it's just getting bigger. every day. It's still growing. And it's just a different process. And you talked about looking at Google Earth, and it's really cool because the other thing you can see is you can see through time the man-made portion of the main delta. You can see that clear, looks like white, right? It's the sand that was newly deposited on some of the new splays that they were new deposit areas that they're building. So you can watch kind of how that prograded too. And then how that was planned and to try to take advantage of, like y'all were talking about earlier, that some of that space between the two deltas, which, it's tough to get the Corps to go far out, right? They're looking for the cheapest place to go and the closest. But it's something that you negotiate and try to work with to try to expand that and not build high, but build bigger and build essentially wider and at a greater scale.
When you say the main delta, you're talking about the delta off of the Atchafalaya River. And you actually can, as you pointed out here, you can go to Google Earth and see the difference in the formation of these two deltas, the Wax Lake being less touched by human activities, so dredging, anything of that nature does not occur over there. But that is, when you talk about the Corps and their activities on the main delta, that's associated with the navigation interest. I know you introduced that at the beginning, but oftentimes, because there are so many complexities in these stories, I like to pause occasionally and just make sure people are following the story. So we've got the main deltas, the Atchafalaya River, and there are some different processes there, and they show up visibly. It's truly a remarkable area. Let's see, Mike, another question about the vegetation. Do we have, these are freshwater systems, we could have this water coming out of the channels, and so we're primarily talking about freshwater plants. Do we have invasive aquatic plants that are very problematic down there at either of these deltas?
Well, I guess the one that sticks out the most would be water hyacinth, right? When it comes from, essentially coming from the north, a lot of it coming through the basin or in the wax from that adjacent marsh to the north. With that flow, all of that freshwater flow coming out, it pushes a lot of that. And I know Larry's, as an old hunter on Atchafalaya, he's fought rafts of water hyacinth coming in, and I mean, they'll come in and take your decoys, but that's the worst. In terms of invasives, not much in terms of like Salvinia, some of the other local issues that we're having in the coast now with Salvinia. Don't see too much of that because it's more of a tidal system, right? And it can get flushed out a little bit easier, as does the water hyacinth, but it can get in there and it can choke off some of the good submerged aquatic vegetation.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons the tidal movement and the river flow, they create hydrologic dynamics in the area that keep either water hyacinth or Salvinia from just sitting, resting, blocking light transmission, because they're always being moved around. And so you see less of an effect on the production of valuable resources, like the sedges, duck potato, and especially submerged aquatics on that particular management area. When
you think about these deltas, what are the primary species that come to mind? Or are there any one or two that are notable, or they're just, is it just a great diversity?
It's more diverse now than it was in the past, I believe. My experience at Atchafalaya Delta starts in January of 1990. Mike is exactly right. Delta duck potato was probably the most valuable food species out there. At low tide, the shape of those mud flats was intriguing because of the way those birds foraged. So now think about the species that can forage on subterranean tubers like that. It was typically mallards, pintails, and canvasbacks. The early years of my hunting out there, those were the species that we focused on. And then as time went on, even in the relatively short period of time of Mike and my hunting out there, as that deltaic system matured, or at least some of the areas matured, more submerged aquatics, higher elevations led to more sedge production. There was actually a spot on the main delta that I referred to as the sedge flat. Well, now you've got food resources that are far more attractive and available to green-winged teal, blue-winged teal, gadwalls using the submerged aquatics. And so now, 30 years after I started hunting there, our bag check data is dominated more by the teal and gadwalls, and less so by mallards and pintails. Now, that's, as you have already indicated, there are multiple factors driving that. But one of the factors is the evolving structure of the habitat. Canvasbacks still pretty much show up in these deltaic systems. Canvasbacks are still very important on those habitats, but mallards and pintails are less important. Gadwall and greenwings are more important. And another thing that's really key, Mike, is that if you wanted to see big flocks of mottled ducks, September and early October in the Atchafalaya Delta, on both the Wax and the main Delta, that was the place to go. They would gather in huge flocks at the edge of those splays that Mike talked about. And that just doesn't happen anymore.
Larry, it's interesting that you mentioned that about mottled ducks. I certainly know, the three of us all know, that the Atchafalaya Delta was an area where a lot of mottled duck research occurred back in the day. A good friend of ours, Dr. Frank Rower, was involved in some of that research. And so it's kind of interesting to hear you say that things have changed, at least with regard to the concentrations of mottled ducks that you saw there. And so this is a good segue when we start talking about waterfowl abundance and some changes in those waterfowl abundances, and perhaps even waterfowl behavior maybe kind of falls into this category. And there's a lot to discuss there. It's apparent to me at this point that we're going to need to make a couple of episodes out of this. So we haven't even gotten into covering the abundances of waterfowl as we began to see them develop there on either of the deltas, as those things started to grow and the habitat resources, food resources became more abundant. And then, of course, the waterfowl hunting that resulted and success of those waterfowl hunting efforts, and then how things changed through time in response to a few advances and innovations, and just how waterfowl hunting changed in general in that region in response to some of those innovations. So if you guys are up for it, I think we'll close out this episode and tell folks to join us on the next episode, because we've got a lot of stories to share there about your prior hunting experiences and a bit of, speculation, you might say. Three scientists will have an opportunity here to speculate on what might be behind some of those changes. You guys sound okay with that?
Sure. Yep.
Sounds good, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Larry Reynolds with LDWF and Mike Carlos with Ducks Unlimited Southern Region down in Lafayette, Louisiana. We appreciate their insight and expertise on the Atchafalaya Delta. It's certainly a neat place and enjoy bringing this story to you. As always, we thank our producer for the work that he does in getting these podcasts out to you. And of course, to our listeners, we thank you for your interest and your investment of time in this resource. And we thank you for your support of wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.